After my husband died, his lawyer said, "Ma'am, he left everything to his young secretary." I was in shock, but I did not fight it. But yesterday, a second lawyer called me. "I have discovered your husband's second will written the day before his death." Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always said that Robert and I were the kind of couple you don't see much anymore. 41 years together. We raised 3 children in the same house in Marietta, Georgia. A white colonial with a wraparound porch and a magnolia tree in the front yard that Robert planted the spring after we got married. He said it would outlive us both. I believed him. I believed most things Robert told me for most of our life together. That was, perhaps, my greatest mistake. For the first 35 years, our marriage was ordinary in the best possible sense. We argued about money when the kids were small, about his long hours when they were teenagers, about whose turn it was to call the plumber when we got older. But we always came back to the dinner table. We always came back to each other. Robert ran a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, Hayes Property Group, that he had built from nothing, starting with a single rented office downtown and a second-hand desk he was so proud of, he photographed it on the first day. That desk still sat in his study when he died. The changes began so gradually that I almost missed them entirely. It was the spring before last. Robert started working later, not occasionally, consistently. He'd always been a hard worker, so at first I told myself it was a new contract, a difficult deal, the usual pressures of running a business in your late 60s, when your body wants rest but your pride won't allow it. But then came the conference calls on Saturday mornings. Then came the new cologne, something sharp and unfamiliar that I found in his bathroom cabinet without ever having bought it for him. Then came the weekend he said he was in Birmingham for a property inspection, and our son Daniel called him to wish him a happy Father's Day, and Robert answered from a restaurant whose background noise sounded nothing like Birmingham, nothing like business. I noticed, but I said nothing. That, too, was a mistake. I had met Crystal Vaughn only twice. She had joined Hayes Property Group about 3 years prior, hired as Robert's executive assistant when his previous secretary retired. She was 34, polished, attentive, and possessed of the particular kind of beauty that makes a woman invisible to wives and magnetic to husbands. The first time I met her was at the company's Christmas party. She shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Hayes, Robert talks about you constantly." I remember thinking she seemed professional, capable. I remember thinking nothing else. The second time I saw her was at Robert's funeral. My husband died on a Tuesday in October. A heart attack, swift and without warning, in his office at 2 in the afternoon. His assistant, Crystal, was the one who called 911. She was the one who rode with him in the ambulance. By the time I arrived at Piedmont Hospital, Robert had already been gone for 20 minutes. I stood in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and fluorescent light, and a nurse I had never met told me my husband of 41 years had died, and I hadn't even been in the room. The funeral was held on a Friday. Our children flew in. Daniel from Chicago, Susan from Portland, and our youngest, Mark, who drove up from Savannah with his wife and the grandchildren. The house was full of casseroles and flowers and people saying, "He was such a good man," and I stood in the middle of all of it feeling like I was made of glass. One wrong touch, and I would shatter. Crystal came to the funeral. She stood near the back in a dark gray dress and dark sunglasses, and she wept in a way that I told myself was professional grief, the grief of a loyal employee. But she stayed longer than any other colleague. And when she left, she pressed my hand and looked at me with eyes that I would later understand held not sorrow, but something far more complicated. 3 weeks after the burial, I sat in the office of Gerald Perkins, Robert's attorney of 15 years, a man I had met at dinner parties, a man who had attended Robert's retirement celebration, a man I had considered, loosely, a family acquaintance. I sat across from him in a leather chair in his office on Peachtree Street, dressed in black, holding my handbag in my lap the way my mother taught me to sit in formal situations, and I waited for him to explain the terms of my husband's will. Gerald Perkins cleared his throat. He did not meet my eyes. "Marjorie," he said, "I need to prepare you for something difficult." And then he told me. Robert had updated his will 14 months prior. The house, our house, the colonial with the magnolia tree, had been transferred into a separate LLC 2 years ago, which meant it fell outside the estate entirely. The firm, Hayes Property Group, had been restructured so that the majority stake passed directly to Crystal Vaughn upon his death. Along with his investment portfolio, his retirement accounts where she had been named primary beneficiary, and the contents of a private savings account I had not known existed, I was left the personal checking account, a modest sum in savings bonds, my car, and the furniture. "He left everything to his secretary," I said. My voice was very calm. I remember being surprised by how calm it was. Gerald Perkins nodded once and looked somewhere past my left shoulder. "I'm sorry, Marjorie. These were his wishes." I stood. I thanked him. I walked to my car, drove out of the parking garage, pulled into a gas station 3 blocks away, and sat there for 45 minutes without moving. I did not cry, not yet. I was still too stunned for tears. What I felt sitting in that car with my hands in my lap was something quieter and far colder than grief. It was the particular silence of a woman who has just discovered that the life she thought she was living was not, in fact, the life she had. I drove home. The magnolia tree was still in the front yard. For now. I spent that first night at the kitchen table, not crying, not drinking, just sitting with a yellow legal pad and a pen, the way I used to sit when the children were young and money was tight, and I needed to make sense of the numbers. I had always been the one who kept the household accounts. Robert handled the business. I handled the home. It had seemed like a reasonable division at the time. Now I understood it had also been a convenient one. Convenient for him. I wrote down everything I knew we owned. The house, the cars, mine and his truck, the furniture and appliances, the contents of our joint checking account, which Gerald Perkins had confirmed would come to me, along with approximately $40,000 in savings bonds in both our names, and a small inherited account from my mother that had always been in my name alone. That last item, I realized with a cold and quiet clarity, was the only money in the world that Robert had not been able to touch. Then I wrote down what I had just been told I would not receive. The house itself, because it had been transferred without my knowledge into an LLC called RH Holdings, registered in Robert's name alone 2 years ago. The firm, the investment portfolio, which Gerald Perkins had estimated at over $900,000, the retirement accounts, the private savings account, whose balance I did not yet know, but which Gerald had referred to with a careful vagueness that told me it was substantial. I stared at those 2 columns for a long time. In 41 years of marriage, I had worked part-time as a bookkeeper until Mark started school, then full-time until I retired at 62 to care for Robert's mother in her final years, a task that had consumed 3 years of my life and that no one, at any point, had suggested compensating me for. I had raised 3 children, maintained a home, entertained clients at dinner parties, organized charitable events for the firm's community profile, and built the kind of stable domestic life that allows a man to focus entirely on building his business without worrying about whether there is food in the refrigerator or clean shirts in his closet. And the reward for that, according to Robert's updated will, was the furniture. Was I angry? Yes. But anger, I had learned over 68 years, is only useful when it's directed somewhere. Unfocused anger is just noise. It warms nothing and builds nothing and changes nothing. So I let myself feel it fully for exactly as long as it needed. And then I set it aside and started thinking. The question was not why. The why was obvious enough. A man in his late 60s facing his own mortality had made choices that prioritized a younger woman who made him feel something his long marriage no longer did. That story was ancient. It was banal. It was devastating and utterly ordinary. I didn't need to understand it. I needed to understand what could be done. I thought about calling Susan. My daughter would have driven through the night to be with me, and she would have wept and raged on my behalf in a way that would have felt, for perhaps an hour, like comfort. But Susan also talked, and I needed no one talking yet. Not until I knew what I was doing. I thought about the women in my church who had been through divorces. The careful, practical conversations I had witnessed over decades about lawyers and asset hiding and what the court could and couldn't reach. I had always listened to those conversations from the outside with the quiet relief of a woman who believed they didn't apply to her. I was awake until 3 a.m, and somewhere in those hours, a thought arrived that was not angry, not desperate, but precise. Gerald Perkins was Robert's attorney. He had drafted the documents that led to this outcome. He had served my husband's interests, not mine, which was, strictly speaking, his job, and not itself illegal. But there was something Gerald had said in the meeting that had snagged in my mind. He had referred to the will as having been updated 14 months prior. Not recently, not on his deathbed, 14 months ago, which meant Robert had been planning this for over a year, while continuing to live with me, eat dinner with me, sleep in our bed, and say, "I love you" on the occasions when the habit of it overtook whatever had replaced the feeling. That date mattered. I didn't yet know why, but I knew it did. I also knew that Gerald Perkins was not the only attorney in Atlanta. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my own doctor because I had not slept, and my hands were shaking, and I am 68 years old, and I have learned to be sensible about my body, even when everything else is falling apart. The second was to Patricia Moore, an old friend from my book club whose niece was a family law attorney in Buckhead. "I need a consultation," I told Patricia. "Something has happened and I need someone on my side." She didn't ask questions. That was why Patricia was one of the few people I trusted completely. The appointment was scheduled for Thursday morning. In the meantime, I had 48 hours, a legal pad, and the beginning of something that wasn't quite a plan yet, but was becoming one. The law office of Ellen Bradshaw was on the 4th floor of a building in Buckhead that smelled of carpet cleaner and coffee, which I found reassuring. I had half expected something intimidating: marble floors, a receptionist who looked through you. But Ellen's waiting room had a basket of magazines and a small succulent on the windowsill, and when Ellen herself came out to greet me, she was 50-something, direct, and wore no-nonsense glasses that reminded me of my high school algebra teacher, who had been the most competent person I had ever known. I laid everything out for her over 90 minutes. The will, the LLC, the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, Gerald Perkins' meeting, the timeline. 14 months prior, Robert had changed the documents. Ellen listened without interrupting, which told me she was good at her job. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marjorie, I want to be honest with you, because I think that serves you better than optimism. Some of this is going to be very difficult to challenge. The retirement account beneficiary designations are almost certainly going to hold. Those pass outside probate. The LLC is more complicated. If the property transfer was done legally, with proper documentation and filing, overturning it requires proving either fraud, undue influence, or a violation of Georgia's elective share statutes." "What are the elective share statutes?" I asked. "Georgia law," she said, "gives a surviving spouse the right to claim 1/3 of the estate, regardless of what the will says. The question is how the estate is defined, and that's where the LLC becomes the battleground. If Robert transferred the house into that LLC specifically to remove it from the marital estate and deprive you of your elective share, that could constitute fraud." She paused. "Can you think of any reason, any legitimate business reason, why your personal residence would need to be held in a commercial LLC?" I could not. Ellen asked me to gather every financial document I could find. Tax returns, bank statements, any paperwork related to RH Holdings, anything connected to the restructuring of the firm. She told me to bring her everything I found and to share it with no one, especially not Gerald Perkins. I drove home with the quiet, purposeful focus of a woman who has been given a task she understands how to perform. For 30 years, I had been a bookkeeper. I knew how to read documents. I knew where to look. What I did not know was that I was already being watched. Crystal Vaughn had wasted no time. Within a week of the funeral, she had appeared at Hayes Property Group each morning as if she had always owned it, because on paper she now did. 2 of Robert's long-standing employees called me privately to say that she had changed the passwords on all the firm's accounts and had asked Gerald Perkins to send a formal letter to the remaining staff outlining the transition of ownership. She had also, according to Robert's longtime office manager, Diane, asked Diane to locate and consolidate all files related to Robert's personal arrangements. Diane had told her those files weren't in the office. Diane had also quietly called me. "I don't know what she's looking for, Marjorie," Diane said, "but she's looking hard." That told me something important. Crystal was nervous. Nervous people make mistakes, but they also move quickly. I needed to move faster. I spent 2 days going through Robert's study. I had not touched it since his death. It had seemed, in those first weeks, like a kind of violation. Now I went through it with the systematic calm of a woman with a purpose. I found the LLC paperwork for RH Holdings in the bottom drawer of his desk, behind a folder of old insurance policies. I found 3 years of personal bank statements for an account at a bank where we had never jointly banked. I found a folder labeled with an almost offensive plainness, Crystal Ania State. Inside that folder were documents I recognized immediately as estate planning paperwork, beneficiary designation forms, a summary of the investment portfolio with Crystal Vaughn's name in the beneficiary field, signed and dated 16 months ago. I photographed everything on my phone and brought the originals to Ellen Bradshaw the following morning. It was on my way home from that second meeting. I was just pulling out of the parking garage, my hands steady on the wheel, when my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. An Atlanta area code. "Is this Marjorie Hayes?" A man's voice, formal, careful. "It is," I said. "Mrs. Hayes, my name is Thomas Calloway. I'm an estate attorney. I believe I need to speak with you about your husband's estate." A pause. "I've recently discovered a second will belonging to Robert Hayes. It was signed and notarized one day before his death." I pulled back into a parking space. "I'm sorry," I said. "Could you repeat that?" "A second will, Mrs. Hayes, executed on October the 12th, the day before Robert passed. I was the notarizing attorney. I've been attempting to determine the correct course of action for the past 2 weeks. Under Georgia law, the most recently executed valid will supersedes all prior documents." His voice was careful, measured. "I believe you should know about this before it becomes relevant in any legal proceeding." I sat in that parking garage for a long time after we hung up. A second will, written the day before Robert died. Whatever my husband had felt for Crystal Vaughn, whatever arrangement he had made, whatever promises, something had changed in those final hours. Something had made Robert Hayes pick up a pen one last time. I didn't yet know what was in that document, but I knew with the certainty of a woman who had just watched her entire life rearrange itself that everything was about to change again. Thomas Calloway's office was in a quieter part of Midtown, on the second floor of a converted townhouse with actual bookshelves on the walls. The kind of office that belongs to a man who has been practicing law for 30 years and no longer needs to impress anyone. He was 65, gray-haired, with a measured manner of someone who has delivered difficult news so many times that it no longer frightens him. Though he understands it still frightens everyone else. He offered me tea. I accepted. He placed a document on the table between us. "Robert came to me on October the 12th, he said. He made an appointment 2 days prior. He arrived alone. He was, I want to be clear about this, entirely lucid. He knew what he was doing. I looked at the will. It was 11 pages. Calloway walked me through it. The language was formal and careful, but the intention was unmistakable. Robert Hayes, on the day before his death, had revoked the prior will entirely. The House, via a parallel document ordering the dissolution of RH Holdings and the transfer of its assets back into the marital estate, was to pass to me. The personal savings account was to be split equally between our 3 children. The investment portfolio was to be divided, 60% to me, 40% in a trust for the grandchildren. Hayes Property Group was to be sold and the proceeds divided equally among me and our children. Crystal Vaughn received nothing. There was a handwritten note attached, not part of the legal document, just a folded piece of paper clipped to the back. Calloway slid it across to me without comment. It was in Robert's handwriting, which I would have recognized anywhere after 41 years. "Marjorie, I know this is too late for some things, but I want to make it right where I still can. I'm sorry. R." I folded the note and placed it in my handbag. I did not read it again in front of Thomas Calloway. I saved that for later. The legal process, Calloway explained, was straightforward in principle. The second will, being more recent and properly executed, superseded the first. However, the prior will was on file with Gerald Perkins, who was acting as the estate's current administrator. Perkins would need to be formally notified. Crystal Vaughn, as the named beneficiary under the first will, would almost certainly contest. "She'll fight this," I said. "Yes," said Calloway, "she will." I called Ellen Bradshaw from the parking lot. She said she'd file the petition to admit the second will to probate by end of week. "Marjorie," she added, her voice holding something careful, "prepare yourself. This is going to get unpleasant." It got unpleasant within 72 hours. The call came from a man named Dennis Price, who identified himself as Crystal Vaughn's attorney. His voice had the smooth, pressurized quality of someone accustomed to intimidating people who don't know their rights. He told me that his client intended to contest the second will on the grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity. He told me that Robert had been under significant emotional stress in his final weeks. He told me, with a delicacy that was really no delicacy at all, that he had documentation suggesting Robert had been manipulated by family pressure in those final days, and that if I pursued this matter, certain personal details about the state of our marriage might become part of the public record. I was standing in my kitchen when he said this. I looked out at the magnolia tree in the front yard. "Mr. Price," I said, "are you threatening me?" "I'm advising you," he said, "that litigation can be costly in ways that go beyond legal fees." "Thank you for your advice," I said. "Please direct all future communication to my attorney, Ellen Bradshaw." And I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I had not agreed to anything, backed down from anything, or revealed anything. Ellen had told me clearly, say nothing, agree to nothing, and let her handle every contact from the other side. 2 days later, Crystal Vaughn showed up at my house. She stood on my porch in a coat that cost more than my monthly grocery budget and looked at me with an expression she had clearly rehearsed. Something meant to read as reasonable, even sympathetic. She said she wanted to talk woman to woman. She said Robert would not have wanted this kind of conflict. She said she had letters, personal letters, that she was willing to use if she had to, but that she would prefer not to. "Crystal," I said from behind my screen door, "whatever you have, bring it to the courtroom." I closed the door. I called Ellen. Ellen told me to document the visit, time, date, what was said. I wrote it down in the yellow legal pad I had been keeping since that first night at the kitchen table. That evening, I drove to Susan's house and let my daughter make me dinner and hold my hand for a few hours, without explaining everything. I didn't need to explain. Susan knew her mother well enough to know that when I was quiet, I was working. For 3 days after that, I let myself rest. I went to church on Sunday. I had lunch with Patricia. I sat on the porch in the October air and watched the neighborhood and let my body recover from the particular exhaustion of sustained fear. I was not done. I was gathering myself. The offer arrived on a Tuesday 3 days after I'd returned from Susan's in the form of a formal letter from Dennis Price's office. It was written in the flat, careful language of legal correspondence, but the meaning was plain enough. Crystal Vaughn, through her attorney, was prepared to settle. She would concede the house. She would transfer ownership of the Colonial back to me outright, along with the joint checking account and savings bonds already designated in the first will. In return, I would withdraw my petition to admit the second will to probate, relinquish any claim to Hayes Property Group, and sign a confidentiality agreement. I read it twice at the kitchen table. Then I set it down and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The offer was, objectively, more than I'd had 3 weeks ago. A woman in a desperate position, frightened, isolated, overwhelmed by grief, might have accepted it. It would have felt in that moment like winning something, like survival. But I was not desperate, and I had stopped being overwhelmed somewhere around the second night at the kitchen table, when I had understood that grief and practicality are not opposites, and that the clearest thinking I had ever done in my life had been done precisely when things were hardest. Crystal wanted the firm. That was what this was about. The house was a bargaining chip. Hayes Property Group was the point, and Robert's second will gave her nothing. So she was trying to trade me back a smaller portion of what was already legally mine in exchange for the thing that mattered. I called Ellen. "Don't touch it," Ellen said immediately. "She's scared. This offer tells us she knows the second will is going to hold." "What about her challenge? The undue influence argument?" "She'll have to prove it," Ellen said. "She'll have to show that someone pressured Robert in those final days. Thomas Calloway was present at the signing. He'll testify that Robert was lucid and acting of his own volition. I like our position, Marjorie. I like it very much." I wrote a one-line response on my own yellow paper, separate from the legal pad, just for myself. They offered because they're losing. I folded it and put it in my cardigan pocket, and I went about my day. I had been, in those weeks, quietly more alone than I'd let myself acknowledge. My children knew something was happening. I had told them in careful, measured conversations that there was a dispute about the will and that my attorney was handling it. I had not told them the full scope, partly to protect them and partly because I needed to carry it myself until I understood what I was carrying. But the settlement offer clarified something. I could not continue carrying this entirely alone, not because I was breaking, but because I had always believed that wisdom comes from other people, if you choose the right ones. On Wednesday, I had lunch with Patricia Moore at the diner on Canton Road. We'd been going to since 1987. I told her everything. Patricia listened, the way she always listened, quietly, without drama, with the focused attention of someone who actually intends to be useful rather than just sympathetic. When I finished, she said, "Do you remember Evelyn Marsh?" I did. Evelyn had been in our Sunday school class 20 years ago. Her husband had died and left the family business to a nephew, claiming his wife had no head for it. Evelyn had fought it in probate court for 2 years and won. "Evelyn still lives over on Shallowford," Patricia said. "Let me call her." Evelyn came for coffee on Thursday. She was 71 now, sharp as ever, and she sat in my kitchen and told me, in the straightforward way of a woman who has been through the fire and come out the other side, exactly what to expect from a contested probate proceeding. The delays, the depositions, the way opposing attorneys try to exhaust you into settling. "They will make you feel tired," she said. "That is the strategy. The strategy is not legal, it's physical. They want you to give up because you're worn out." "I've raised 3 children," I said. "I know about being worn out and continuing anyway." Evelyn smiled. "Then you're going to be fine." On Friday, I called my son Daniel in Chicago. I told him everything. The silence on the other end of the line lasted about 4 seconds, and then Daniel said, with the controlled fury of a man who had inherited his mother's practicality, "Mom, what do you need?" "I don't need money," I told him. "I need you to know, and I need you to trust that I have this. He drove down anyway that weekend because he is my son and he understood that knowing and coming are different things. He stayed through Sunday, helped me organize the document files Ellen had requested, and took me to dinner at the Italian place on Roswell Road where we used to go on his birthday when he was small. Over dinner, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're the steadiest person I know, Mom." I thought about that on the drive home. I wasn't sure I was steady. I was functioning. I was doing the next necessary thing and then the next one after that, and refusing very deliberately to look at the distance remaining. That is how you finish long things. Crystal Vaughn and Dennis Price were watching. I knew they were watching. They had sent one offer and received silence. And silence when you are afraid is the worst possible answer. Let them watch, I thought. Daniel left on Sunday evening, and by Monday the house had resumed its particular quality of quiet, the kind that either breaks you or becomes your ally. I had decided some time ago that it would be the latter. On Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang at 10 o'clock. I looked through the peephole and saw Crystal Vaughn standing on my porch, and next to her, Dennis Price. Crystal was holding what appeared to be a small arrangement of flowers, grocery store lilies wrapped in cellophane. Price stood slightly behind her, holding a briefcase, wearing the expression of a man who has calculated exactly how long this visit needs to take. I called Ellen Bradshaw first, from the kitchen, while they stood on my porch. "They're here," I said quietly. "Don't let Price into the conversation about legal matters," Ellen said. "If he starts talking case specifics, you stop him immediately. If you want, you don't have to let them in at all." "No," I said. "I want to hear what they say." I opened the door. I did not open the screen. "Marjorie," Crystal said. Her voice was warm, modulated carefully. She held out the flowers. "I know this has been so hard for all of us. I've been carrying so much grief. Robert was. He meant so much to me as a mentor, as a—" "You can come in," I said to Crystal. "Mr. Price can wait on the porch." Price's expression didn't change. He nodded once and stepped back. I let Crystal in. We sat in the living room, she on the couch, I in the armchair that had been my preferred seat for 30 years. She put the flowers on the coffee table. I did not put them in water. She began with grief. This was, I recognized, a deliberate choice. Establish common ground, humanize herself, lower my defenses. She spoke about how much she had admired Robert, what a mentor he had been, how she understood that this situation must look a certain way from the outside, but that the reality was more complicated. She said, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on mine, that Robert had been unhappy for a long time, and that she had only ever wanted what was best for him. I said nothing. I let her talk. Then she shifted, gradually, carefully, the way you shift weight when you're trying not to be noticed doing it. She talked about the second will. She said she understood Robert had made a last-minute change under difficult circumstances, that he had been under emotional pressure, possibly from family, possibly from guilt, possibly from the medications he had been prescribed after his first minor cardiac event 6 months prior. She said that she didn't want to go through a long, public, painful legal process. She said that she was prepared to be generous, more generous than the first settlement offer, because she believed that was what Robert would have wanted. What Robert wanted, I said, is in the second will. Marjorie. She leaned forward slightly. You're 68 years old. A legal battle like this takes years. It costs money, it costs health, it costs peace of mind. I'm offering you the chance to walk away with your home, your dignity, and enough to live on comfortably. Why would you put yourself through this? There it was. The actual argument, stripped of the flowers and the grief and the folded hands. You're old, you're tired. Take what I'm offering and disappear. I looked at her for a moment. Crystal, I said, my husband wrote that second will of his own free will, one day before he died. He did it because he knew what he'd done was wrong. Your attorney is welcome to argue otherwise in front of a judge. That's what judges are for. Her expression changed. It was subtle. A tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the lips. But I had been reading people's faces for 68 years, and I knew what I was seeing. The warmth was gone. You're making a mistake, she said quietly. That may be, I said, but it's mine to make. She stood. She left the flowers on the table. In the hallway, she paused and turned back and said, with a directness that was almost refreshing after all the performance, I have emails, Marjorie, a lot of them. Personal emails between Robert and me going back 3 years. Things a wife wouldn't want read aloud in a courtroom. Then bring them, I said. My attorney will be there. She left. Price followed without a word. I watched from the window as they got into a black car and drove away. Then I sat back down in my armchair and let myself feel it. The fear, real and physical, a cold spreading through my chest, because she might have those emails, and even if their legal relevance was limited, the idea of Robert's words to another woman being read into a public record was its own particular kind of pain. But here is what I understood, sitting in that chair. The fear told me that this mattered. And things that matter are worth fighting for, even when they cost you. I picked up my phone and called Ellen. They came, I said. She mentioned emails. Of course she did, Ellen said, with the calm of someone who has heard this particular move before. Let her bring them. Private communications don't prove undue influence. And a judge isn't going to let a fishing expedition into your marriage derail a properly executed will. She's bluffing, Marjorie. Or if she isn't bluffing, the emails don't help her case anyway. I hung up and looked at the lilies on the coffee table. Then I carried them to the kitchen and put them in a vase, because they hadn't done anything wrong. The probate hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January, 3 months after Robert's death. Ellen had prepared me the way a good coach prepares an athlete, not by promising victory, but by making certain I understood every scenario well enough that nothing in that courtroom would surprise me. Crystal's team will argue 3 things, Ellen had told me in our final preparation meeting. 1, Robert lacked testamentary capacity due to cardiac medication. 2, undue influence from family members, meaning you and your children. 3, the second will was produced under duress. Calloway will demolish 1 and 2. 3 is their weakest argument, and they know it. What they're hoping, she said, is that something breaks down in the room. Nothing will break down, I said. She looked at me over her glasses. I know, she said. The Fulton County Probate Court was a building I had driven past many times without ever imagining I would enter. I wore the same dark blue dress I had worn to Robert's firm's 40th anniversary dinner 3 years ago. I sat with Ellen at one table. Crystal Vaughn sat with Dennis Price at the other in a charcoal suit that was impeccably correct and perfectly blank. Thomas Calloway testified first. He was precise, unhurried, and thorough. He had been a notary and estate attorney for 31 years. He had met with Robert Hayes on October the 12th for a 2-hour appointment. Robert had arrived alone, without any family member present. He had been oriented, conversational, and specific. He had provided Calloway with a prior draft of revisions he had handwritten himself. He had asked detailed questions about the dissolution of RH Holdings and the legal mechanism for transferring the property back into the marital estate. He was, Calloway said, one of the more legally literate clients I've had in recent years. He understood exactly what he was signing. Price cross-examined him for 40 minutes, focusing on the cardiac medication. A beta blocker, standard, nothing that affects cognition in normal doses. Calloway cited 2 medical references. Price moved on. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Ellen had, in the 3 months of preparation, done something Price had not anticipated. She had subpoenaed the records from Robert's cardiologist, not to confirm the medication, which Price had already anticipated, but to establish the timeline of Robert's first cardiac episode 6 months prior to his death. That episode, minor in itself, had apparently prompted a conversation between Robert and his doctor about end-of-life planning. The cardiologist had recommended that Robert update his affairs. That appointment had occurred on October the 8th, 4 days before Robert walked into Calloway's office. Ellen introduced the medical records. Price objected on relevance grounds. The judge, a woman of about 60 with an expression of practiced neutrality, overruled him. Then Ellen called a witness Price had not known about. Diane Kaminsky, Robert's office manager of 18 years, took the stand. She was 60, quiet, and clearly uncomfortable, but she answered every question directly. She testified that in the week before Robert's death, he had asked her, not Crystal, specifically not Crystal, to locate contact information for Thomas Calloway, whose card had been in the firm's files from a conference several years prior. She testified that Robert had told her, "Don't mention this to anyone in the office, Diane. I need to handle something personal." The implication was clear. Robert had sought Calloway specifically and privately, without Crystal's knowledge. Not under family pressure, not under duress, but deliberately in secret from the very person who claimed the prior will reflected his true wishes. I watched Crystal's face during Diane's testimony. The composed blankness she had maintained for 3 months began, at the edges, to slip. Her jaw tightened. She wrote something on a notepad in front of her and slid it to Price. Price stood for cross-examination of Diane and asked her when she had first spoken to me after Robert's death. Diane said she had called me approximately 1 week after the funeral. Price suggested, not very subtly, that I had coached her testimony. Ellen objected. The judge sustained it. Price then moved to introduce Crystal's emails, the ones she had threatened me with on my porch. The judge reviewed them in chambers. They were, as Ellen had predicted, irrelevant to the question of testamentary capacity or undue influence. They were personal. They were painful to know existed. The judge excluded them. Crystal, I noticed, had gone very still. Price made his closing argument. It was competent and hollow. A man arguing from a weak position with strong vocabulary. He used the word vulnerable 11 times in reference to Robert, which I counted because counting kept me from reacting to it. Ellen was 12 minutes. Precise, factual, sequential. The will was properly executed. The testator was competent. The motive for the change was documented. A cardiac scare, a doctor's advice, a private appointment made 4 days later without the knowledge of the prior beneficiary. This, Ellen said, is not a mystery. It is a man correcting a mistake before it was too late. The judge recessed. When she returned 40 minutes later, her expression had not changed, but her ruling was 3 sentences. The second will was valid. It superseded all prior documents. The petition was granted. I did not cry. I sat very still with my hands folded in my lap, the way my mother had taught me to sit in formal situations, and I breathed. Across the room, Dennis Price was already talking in a low, urgent voice to Crystal Vaughn. She was not responding. She was staring at the table. The weeks after the ruling were not dramatic. That was the first thing I would tell anyone who asked. The victory, when it came, arrived not as a wave, but as a tide. Gradual, undeniable, and thoroughly complete. Ellen filed the necessary paperwork to begin the formal transfer of assets. Gerald Perkins withdrew from the matter with a letter that was legally careful and personally cowardly. He did not call me. I did not call him. The first concrete thing to change was the house. RH Holdings was dissolved by court order in mid-February. The title to the Colonial was transferred back into my name alone. I stood in the front yard on the afternoon I received the confirmation in a coat because it was February, and I put my hand on the magnolia tree Robert had planted 41 years ago and said nothing, because some moments are complete without words. The investment portfolio was divided according to the second will, 60% to me, the remainder into a trust for the grandchildren, administered by Daniel. My portion arrived in a new account in March. I did not look at the balance for 2 days. When I finally did, I thought about the years of dinner parties and school pickups and elder care that had contributed to it, and I decided to feel entitled to every cent. Crystal attempted one further legal action. Price filed a motion to reconsider, citing a letter allegedly from Robert expressing doubt about the second will. The letter was submitted without authentication. Handwriting analysis showed significant inconsistencies with authenticated samples. The motion was denied. 2 weeks later, Crystal dismissed Price and retained new counsel. The new counsel contacted Ellen to discuss a negotiated resolution. Ellen told them there was nothing to negotiate. Crystal did not pursue further litigation. Hayes Property Group was listed for sale in March and sold in May to a larger regional firm. The sale price was something I did not discuss publicly. What I will say is that it was sufficient. Our 3 children received their shares. Susan paid off her mortgage. Daniel put his into the trust. Mark stabilized his business. I paid Ellen her full fee and wrote her a note that said only, "Thank you for being on my side." She replied, "You were on your own side first. That was the work." I have thought about that often since. Crystal, I learned through Diane, did not fare well. The new ownership of Hayes Property Group had no obligation to retain her, and she was not offered a role. She had structured her finances around inheriting the firm, and receiving nothing required significant adjustment. She moved from the Midtown apartment Robert had apparently been paying for and relocated to another city. I did not feel satisfaction at this. I felt completion. The particular quiet of a story that has reached its actual ending, rather than the one, someone tried to impose on it. I was 68 years old. I owned my house. I had enough to live well. My children were whole and my grandchildren were provided for, and the magnolia tree was still in the front yard. Robert had made a terrible mistake for years, and then in the last hours he tried to undo it. I had given him 41 years. I chose to remember both of those things. By the following autumn, my life looked almost nothing like what it had been, and almost everything like what I had not known it could be. I had spent years becoming smaller, incrementally. You stop suggesting restaurants you actually like. You stop mentioning opinions that complicate conversations. You stop making plans that don't account for his schedule. You don't notice it happening. And then one day, you're sitting in a gas station parking lot, and you understand that the smallest version of yourself is sitting in that car. And you decide she will not be the last version. I took a watercolor class on Tuesday mornings. I had wanted to do this for 20 years. I was not a talented painter. I was an enthusiastic one. I decided the second was enough. I went to Portland to visit Susan in October. We spent 5 days doing nothing in particular. Walking, eating, going to a small theater on a Wednesday evening, because there was no longer any Wednesday obligation. I slept well. I hadn't realized how long it had been. Daniel brought the grandchildren for Thanksgiving. My grandson Oliver asked why there was a big tree out front. I told him his grandfather had planted it the year they got married. He said, "That's pretty cool actually," and ran off in the best possible response. I made an appointment with a financial advisor I chose myself for the first time in my adult life. The plan included a contribution to the youth arts program at my grandchildren's school, something I had wanted to do for years without having my own money to do it with. That felt like freedom. As for Crystal, Dennis Price had settled a professional misconduct complaint and agreed to supervise practice. Crystal had moved away and was working in commercial real estate elsewhere. I hoped she was doing it honestly, not because what she had done was forgivable, but because bitterness requires continuous tending, and I had more interesting things to do with my energy. There was a morning in late October when I sat on the porch with my coffee and let myself feel the full weight of everything. The loss of the marriage I'd thought I had, the loss of the man I'd thought he was. Though the man who planted the magnolia tree had also been real. People are rarely entirely one thing. I sat there for a long time. Then I put on my good walking shoes and went to my watercolor class. Gwen had us painting leaves. Mine were imprecise and probably anatomically incorrect. I was pleased with them anyway. What I learned was this: a woman who knows her own worth is not cruel, not bitter, not vengeful. She is simply clear. And clarity, it turns out, is more powerful than anger. If someone had tried to take everything from you, would you have fought back or walked away? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. Thank you, truly, for listening. My son-in-law fraudulently sold my house for $1.8 million. Now you will live in your car. He showed me fake documents. I smiled and drove away. He had no idea that the house he sold was actually... Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always said Tom and I built a good life. I believed them because I had seen the receipts. 38 years of mortgage payments, 2 daughters raised in that house on Sycamore Hill, a garden where the roses came back every April without being asked. When Tom died of a heart attack 6 years ago, the house became the loudest thing in my life. Every room still smelled like him, like sawdust and coffee and Old Spice. I kept his reading chair by the window. I watered his tomatoes. I was 72 years old and I had no intention of going anywhere. My younger daughter, Linz, had married Derek Collins 8 years before all of this happened. I want to be fair to Lindsay because she was my child and I loved her, but fairness requires me to say what was true. She had always needed someone to tell her what to think. In high school, it was her girlfriends. In college, it was a boyfriend who lasted 2 semesters and left without a note. Then came Derek. He was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a tailored suit, always pressed, always fitted, never quite real. He sold commercial real estate in Phoenix, which meant he knew the language of property, the grammar of deeds and titles and closing costs. He spoke it fluently, and he knew that most people didn't understand a word. The first warning sign came 18 months before the day I'm about to describe. Derek started asking questions about the house. Casual questions, the kind you could wave away. What did you pay for it originally, Marjorie? What do you figure it's worth now? I told him what Tom and I had paid in 1986, $94,000, and watched something flicker behind his eyes. I didn't name it then. I should have. 3 months later, he mentioned a property attorney he knew, someone who could help me get my estate in order. I said my estate was perfectly in order, thank you. He smiled the way he always smiled when he thought I was being simple. Then came the visits. Not to see me, I want to be precise about that. Derek began driving out to Sycamore Hill on Saturday mornings, walking the perimeter of the property, standing in the backyard with his phone out. Once I watched him from the kitchen window as he paced off distances along the fence line, tapping something into a notes app. When I opened the back door and asked what he was doing, he said he was thinking about whether I needed a new fence. The old one was perfectly fine. I said so. He said, "Just looking out for you, Marjorie." I went back inside and stood at the sink for a long time, looking at the garden Tom had planted. Lindsay stopped calling as often. When she did call, she sounded rehearsed, like someone reading from a script they hadn't fully memorized. She asked whether I had thought about downsizing. She mentioned a lovely senior community in Scottsdale. I was 72. Not 102, and I had a driver's license and a full set of teeth, and I climbed those porch steps every single day without difficulty. I told her I wasn't interested in Scottsdale. There was a pause on her end of the line that told me everything I needed to know about whose idea Scottsdale had been. The day it happened was a Tuesday in March. Derek called and asked if he could stop by. He said he had some paperwork he wanted to walk me through, something about a property trust that would protect the house from probate. He used enough legal-sounding words that I almost let it slide past me. I said he could come at 2 o'clock. He arrived with a leather folder and Lindsay, who stood near the door like she was trying to be invisible. Derek sat across from me at the kitchen table and laid out a set of documents. He pointed to lines, explained provisions, used the word fiduciary twice. And then he slid the top sheet across to me and said I just needed to sign where he'd highlighted. I looked at the documents for a long time. Then I looked at him. "Derek," I said, "what exactly is this?" He leaned back, and then he told me. Not all of it. Not the $1.8 million, not the buyer already lined up, not the closing date 3 weeks away, just the part he thought would finish me. He said the house had already been put under a contract. He said my signature on these papers would simply confirm the transfer. He said, and I will remember this sentence until the day I die, "You're going to have to be realistic, Marjorie. The sale is done. You'll be comfortable in Scottsdale, or you can make this difficult and figure out where you're sleeping on your own." He smiled. Lindsay looked at the floor. I looked at the documents one more time. I looked at Derek Collins, who had just told me in my own kitchen, in Tom's house, that I would be living in my car. And I smiled. All right, I said, let me think about it. I picked up my purse, stood up, and walked out the front door. I heard Derek say something to Lindsay behind me, something that had the shape of victory in it. He thought I was defeated. He thought I was an old woman who didn't understand what had just happened to her. He was wrong, because what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing there in my kitchen with his leather folder and his borrowed legal vocabulary, was that the house he believed he had just sold had a story he had never bothered to read, and I had read every page of it. I drove to the end of Sycamore Hill and pulled over under the big eucalyptus at the corner, the one the city had been threatening to cut down for years. I turned off the engine. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, and I did not cry. I want to say that clearly. I did not cry. What I did was something colder and quieter. I made an inventory. The house was worth $1.8 million. Derek had said as much, indirectly, by the sheer confidence with which he had moved. A man doesn't hand you fake documents and tell you you'll be sleeping in your car unless the number on the other end of the deal is large enough to make the risk feel worth it. I had lived in that house for 31 years. Tom and I had paid it off in 2004. It was mine outright, free and clear. Title recorded with Maricopa County under the names Thomas Arthur Hayes and Marjorie Ellen Hayes. When Tom died, I had inherited his half without complication. I knew this because I had sat across from our estate attorney, Frank Delgado, in his Tempe office and signed every document myself, with my own hand while understanding what I was signing. So how exactly does a house you own outright get sold without your knowledge? I started thinking through it the way Tom used to think through a broken engine, not in a panic, but methodically, piece by piece. Derek was in commercial real estate. He understood title transfers, escrow processes, how documents move through a system. If he had been planning this for 18 months, and I now believed he had, he'd had time to be careful. The documents he'd shown me in the kitchen were designed to look like a formality, like the last step. But there had to have been earlier steps, earlier papers, earlier signatures. And that was where he had made his mistake. I hadn't signed anything, not in the past year, not anything related to that house. I had signed a new insurance policy in October and a consent form at my dentist's office in January, and that was all. Which meant that if there was a contract, if there was a deed in progress, if there were papers moving through escrow with my name on them, those signatures were not mine. That is called forgery. I knew the word. Tom had been a contractor, and he had once had a subcontractor forge his signature on a materials invoice. He'd taken it to an attorney and recovered every penny. I had sat next to him in that attorney's office 30 years ago, and I had listened, and I had learned. I started the car and drove to Rutt's house. Ruth Gardner had been my neighbor for 24 years. She was 69, recently retired from 30 years as an office administrator at Maricopa County Superior Court. She knew the inside of a courthouse the way some people know their own kitchen. I pulled into her driveway at 4:15 on that Tuesday afternoon, and when she opened the door and saw my face, she said, "Come in and sit down, and I'll put the kettle on, and then you're going to tell me everything." I told her everything. Ruth listened the way good people listen, completely, without interrupting, without reassuring me prematurely. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marjorie, do you still have your original deed?" "In the fireproof box under Tom's side of the bed," I said, "along with the title insurance policy. the payoff letter from the mortgage, and every property tax statement going back to 2001. Ruth nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Now listen to me carefully. You do not call Lindsay. You do not call Derek. You do not acknowledge to either of them that anything is wrong. Can you do that?" I said I could. "Tomorrow morning," she said, "you are going to call the Maricopa County Recorder's Office and ask them to pull up the current record on your property. You want to know if anything has been filed against it in the past 24 months. Liens, transfers, anything. If Derek has been moving paper, the recorder's office will have it." I wrote that down on the back of a grocery receipt from my purse. "And then," Ruth said, "you are going to call a real estate attorney. Not Frank Delgado. He's retired. Someone who handles fraud. I know someone. His name is Stephen Morrow. He's good, Marjorie. He's the kind of attorney who doesn't get rattled." I looked at her across the kitchen table with our tea going cold between us in the ordinary yellow light of a Tuesday evening, and I felt something settle in me. Not calm exactly, not peace. Something harder than that. The kind of stillness that comes right before you decide to fight. "I'll call first thing in the morning," I said. Ruth reached across the table and put her hand over mine. "He thinks you walked out of there beaten," she said. "I know," I said. "Let him keep thinking that." I drove home to Sycamore Hill as the sun went down behind the ridge. I pulled into my own driveway and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house. The porch Tom had rebuilt in 2009, the roses along the front walk, the window of the room that had been Lindsay's when she was small. I thought about Derek sitting at my kitchen table with his leather folder, so certain of himself, so sure that a 72-year-old woman with a garden and a fireproof box under her bed would simply fold. I went inside, made dinner, and watered Tom's tomatoes. Then I got the fireproof box out from under the bed, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to read every document I owned. By 10 o'clock that night, I had my first plan. I called the Maricopa County Recorder's Office at 8:03 the following morning. The moment their automated system said a representative was available. I had the parcel number for 14 Sycamore Hill written on a notepad in front of me, along with the legal description from my original deed. The woman who answered was patient and efficient. She pulled up the record while I waited. There had been 2 filings against my property in the previous 14 months. The first was a recorded document dated 11 months ago, a special warranty deed purporting to transfer my property into a trust called the Hayes Family Revocable Trust. The grantor on the deed was listed as Marjorie E. Hayes. The trustee of the new trust was listed as Derek L. Collins. The second filing was dated 6 weeks ago, a purchase and sale agreement addendum, filed as a preliminary instrument ahead of a pending escrow close. The buyer was a holding company called Meridian Residential, LLC. The sale price was $1,820,000. My hands were steady when I wrote down those numbers. My voice was steady when I thanked the woman and asked her to hold the records for a possible legal proceeding. She told me I could request certified copies, which I said I would do in person that afternoon. I called Stephen Morrow's office at 8:20. Ruth had already spoken to him. She had called him the previous evening after I left, which was the most Ruth Gardner thing I had ever heard, and I was grateful for it. His assistant said he could see me at 11. Stephen Morrow's office was in a low brick building in Tempe, the kind of place that communicated competence without theatrics. He was in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades sitting across from people in bad situations. He read the documents I had brought, the certified copies from the recorder's office, my original deed, the mortgage payoff letter, without speaking for nearly 10 minutes. When he looked up, he said, "Mrs. Hayes, do you recognize the signature on this special warranty deed?" He turned the page toward me. Someone had signed my name in blue ink. The handwriting had a superficial resemblance to mine, same general slant, same approximate letter height. But it was not mine. The M in Marjorie curved differently. The H in Hayes didn't close at the top the way mine did. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over 7 decades. I knew what it looked like. "That is not my signature," I said. He nodded as if he had expected exactly this answer. "Then what we're looking at," he said, "is deed fraud through forgery, fraudulent filing with a county recorder, and attempted theft of real property. This is a felony in Arizona under ARS Section 13-2312. Depending on what we find in the escrow documentation, we may also be looking at wire fraud if any electronic transfers were initiated." He asked me several questions. Had I ever given Derek power of attorney? No. Had I ever signed any document that gave him authority over my property? Not knowingly. Had I received any money from any transaction related to the house? None. Did I have any record of what documents Derek had shown me the previous day? I had taken photographs of them with my phone before I left the kitchen. I had done this while appearing to look at them one last time before I stood up. The screen angled down, the camera silent. Stephen Morrow looked at me for a moment with something that might have been professional admiration. "That was smart," he said. "Tom always said read the document twice before you sign it," I said. "But he also said if something looks wrong, start recording." Stephen told me he would file an emergency motion to stop the escrow. A lis pendens, a notice of pending litigation recorded against the property that would legally freeze the sale before it could close. He explained this had to happen before the closing date, which was 19 days away. He also said he would contact the Maricopa County Attorney's Office to report the fraud, and that I should be prepared for this to become a criminal matter, not just a civil one. He asked if I was prepared for that. I thought about Derek at my kitchen table. I thought about Lindsay looking at the floor. "Yes," I said. What I didn't know, as I drove home from Tempe that afternoon with the certified copies in a manila envelope on the passenger seat, was that Derek had already noticed something was wrong. Not because he was clever. He wasn't, not really, beneath the confidence, but because he had called the escrow company that morning to check on a timeline detail, and the escrow officer had mentioned, almost in passing, that there had been an inquiry on the parcel from the recorder's office. Someone had pulled the filing history. He called Lindsay. I learned later that the call lasted 44 minutes. By the time I pulled into my driveway on Sycamore Hill, Derek Collins knew that Marjorie Hayes was not, in fact, beaten. But the lis pendens had already been filed at 2:47 that afternoon. The house wasn't going anywhere. Stephen moved quickly. Within 48 hours of our meeting, the lis pendens was on record. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office had received his formal complaint with supporting documentation, and he had sent a letter by certified mail to Derek L. Collins and to Meridian Residential LLC notifying both parties that the property at 14 Sycamore Hill was the subject of pending litigation alleging deed fraud and forgery. The escrow, Stephen told me, would almost certainly freeze. No title company in Arizona would close a sale with the Elise pendants on record and a criminal referral in process. I went about my days as normally as I could manage. I watered the garden. I drove to the grocery store. I had lunch with Ruth on Thursday at the diner on Central, and she watched me eat a full plate of eggs and toast and said, "You look calmer than you have any right to look." I told her that calm was a decision and that I had made it. What I didn't tell her was that at 2 o'clock in the morning, I sometimes lay awake in Tom's house and listened to the silence and wondered whether I had made the decision too late, whether something irreversible had already moved through the machinery of escrow without my knowing. Stephen said we had caught it in time. I tried to believe him. Then, on the Saturday morning after the list pendants was filed, a car I recognized pulled into my driveway. Derek and Lindsay got out together. This told me something immediately. Derek had decided he needed her there, which meant he was not entirely confident in himself. He rang the bell rather than knocking, which was a formality he had never bothered with before. And when I opened the door, his face had the particular tightness of a man who is very angry and working very hard not to show it. "We need to talk, Marjorie," he said. I stepped onto the porch rather than inviting them in. I sat down in the rocking chair. I did not offer them seats. "Go ahead," I said. What followed was approximately 20 minutes of escalation that I will describe as accurately as I can, because accuracy matters here. Derek began with what I would call controlled aggression. He told me I was making a serious mistake, that the trust arrangement had been designed to protect me, that I had clearly been given some very bad advice. When I said nothing in response to this, he moved to financial pressure. He said the buyer would likely sue for breach of contract, that I would face legal fees that could devastate my savings, that the smarter move was to let the sale proceed and take my share. When I asked him to define what share he had in mind for me, given that it was entirely my property he had been selling, his composure slipped. "You are going to lose this house one way or another," he said. His voice had dropped into something quieter and more deliberate. "The county attorney isn't going to pursue this. Do you know how many of these referrals they get? They file them away. Your lawyer is going to cost you $40,000, and that buyer isn't going away. You are an old woman living alone in a house worth $2 million, and every day you fight this, you're burning through whatever you've got left." Lindsay, behind him, said, "Mom, just please listen to him." I looked at my daughter. I thought about all the years I had loved her and all the ways that love had been, apparently, insufficient armor against the man standing next to her. And I said very quietly, "Lindsay, I hope one day you understand what he's been doing. Not to me, to both of us." She looked away. I stood up from the rocking chair. I was not tall. I never had been. But I stood up straight, the way my own mother had taught me, and I looked at Derek Collins and I said, "I would like you both to leave my property now. Any further communication should go through my attorney, Stephen Morrow. You have his contact information because he sent you a letter this week." Derek stared at me for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Then he turned and walked back down the porch steps, and Lindsay followed him without looking at me. The car backed out of the driveway with more speed than necessary. I sat back down in the rocking chair. My hands were shaking very slightly, which I had not allowed myself to notice while they were standing in front of me. The shaking lasted about 3 minutes. Then it stopped. I called Stephen and told him about the visit. He said I had done exactly right, and that Derek's attempt to contact me directly while litigation was pending was noted and would be documented. Then he told me to rest. He said there was nothing for me to do in the next few days except let the legal process move, and that wearing myself out with worry would not help any of it. I took his advice. I drove up to Sedona on Sunday morning, a drive I had made with Tom every spring for 20 years. And I stayed 2 nights at a small motel near Oak Creek, the one with the red porch and the hummingbirds at the feeder outside the window. I hiked Cathedral Rock to the first plateau, which took me longer than it once had, and sat on a warm sandstone shelf and watched the hawks circling below the rim. It was the first time in 2 weeks I had breathed without measuring it. I came home from Sedona on Tuesday morning. The tomatoes needed water, and the roses along the front walk had opened 3 new blooms while I was gone. A pale yellow variety Tom had called Peace, which he'd planted the year our youngest was born. I stood on the porch for a moment before going inside, looking at my house the way you look at something you almost lost, and I thought, not a chance. There was a voicemail on my landline. I still had a landline. Tom had always said cell signals were unreliable in a storm, from a number I didn't recognize. When I played it, a man's voice introduced himself as Gary Perella, a representative from Meridian Residential, LLC. He said he understood there had been some confusion around the title of the property, and that Meridian was very interested in resolving the situation directly and amicably. He said Meridian was prepared to offer me a generous cash settlement in exchange for withdrawing the Ellis pendants. He used the phrase, generous cash settlement twice, which told me it was not, in fact, particularly generous, and that he was reading from a script someone else had written. I wrote down Gary Perella's number. Then I called Stephen. Stephen said exactly what I had expected him to say. Meridian's attempt to contact me directly while the Ellis pendants was on record and litigation was pending was legally aggressive and strategically foolish. They were either poorly advised or panicking. He said not to call Gary Perella back. He said he would handle it. What does it mean that they're reaching out? I asked. It means the Lice pendants is working, Stephen said. It means the buyer's investors are getting nervous. A clouded title is worthless to a development company. They can't build, can't sell, can't finance against it. Every week this sits unresolved costs them money. I thanked him and hung up. I made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table where Derek had laid out his fake documents 3 weeks earlier, and I let myself feel something I hadn't quite allowed yet. I let myself feel that I was winning. It was careful, that feeling. I didn't let it become overconfidence, but I let it be real. The unexpected support came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Ruth had mentioned my situation, with my permission and without names initially, to a group she had been part of for several years, a gathering of women, mostly in their 60s and 70s, who met twice a month at the library on Southern Avenue. They had started as a book club and gradually become something harder to categorize, the kind of group that forms when women who have lived long enough realize they have more practical use for each other than for a curated reading list. Ruth called it the Thursday Group. They called themselves, with some irony, the Silver Foxes. Ruth asked if I would come to the next meeting and tell my story. I almost said no. I am a private person. Tom was more the talker. And the idea of sitting in a circle of strangers and describing what Derek had done made something in me want to retreat. But Ruth said, Marjorie, There are 11 women in that room. I will bet you 7 of them have a story that rhymes with yours in some way. And because Ruth has been right about most things for 24 years, I said yes. The meeting was on a Thursday evening in late March, in a side room at the library that smelled of old paper and industrial carpet cleaner, which I found entirely comforting. I told my story without dramatizing it, the way I had told Stephen, just the facts in order, what I knew and when I knew it, and what I had done about it. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a woman named Cecilia, who looked to be about 75 and had the kind of face that had clearly weathered a great deal and come out determined, said, "My son-in-law tried something similar 3 years ago. Different method, same idea. Thought I didn't understand my own finances." She paused. "He underestimated me, too." She said it without triumph. She said it as a statement of plain fact. 2 other women in the room nodded in ways that meant more than agreement with an anecdote. By the end of the evening, I had 3 phone numbers from women who had navigated legal and financial battles with family members and come through the other side. One recommendation for an expert witness who specialized in document forgery for civil cases, and something I hadn't known I was missing: the specific grounding solidarity of being believed by people who understood exactly what kind of war was being waged and why. And I drove home at 9 o'clock under a sky full of stars, and I thought, Derek Collins has never once in his life been underestimated, and I have been underestimated every day of mine. That is not a disadvantage. That is an edge. They came on a Wednesday. This time Lindsay called first, which was new, and her voice had a softness I recognized as performance. I had been her mother for 44 years, and I knew the difference between her genuine softness and the version she deployed when she wanted something. She said Derek felt terrible about how their last visit had gone. She said they wanted to come over, just to talk. No pressure, no lawyers, just family. She said the word family 3 times in 4 sentences. I said they were welcome to come for coffee at 10. I called Stephen immediately after. He said I was not legally obligated to see them, but that if I chose to, I should not agree to anything, sign anything, or make any verbal commitments, and that I should record the conversation if I felt comfortable doing so. Arizona is a one-party consent state. I set my phone behind the fruit bowl before they arrived, recorder running, face down. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited, which is its own kind of preparation. Derek came in looking humbled, which on him was like a coat that didn't fit. He shook my hand, which he had never done in 8 years of marriage to my daughter. Lindsay poured her own coffee and looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone who had not been home in a long time. She touched the counter near the window, the spot where Tom used to leave his keys, and something moved across her face that I chose not to examine. Derek began. He said he could see, in retrospect, that he had gone about things the wrong way. He said he'd been trying to protect me from the burden of managing a property this size. Taxes, maintenance, liability, and that his intentions had been good even if his methods had been imperfect. He used that word carefully, the way a person selects a word specifically for its smallness. He said he should have come to me first, openly, as family. He was sorry about that. He had practiced being sorry, and he had done a competent job of it. And then, with the apology still warm on the table, he made his pivot. He said Meridian was prepared to offer me $400,000 in cash if I would withdraw the lease pendants and allow the escrow to proceed. $400,000 delivered to my account within 10 days of closing. He said it was more money than I could realistically spend in the remaining years of my life. He said, and here his voice took on the texture of barely concealed contempt, that the legal process I had started would drag on for 2 or 3 years, cost me everything I had saved, and end with me owning a house I couldn't maintain on a fixed income in a neighborhood changing around me anyway. You could have $400,000 and a fresh start, he said, or you could have a lawsuit. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into something meant to sound confidential. He said a financial planner had done some numbers and that a woman my age, with $400,000 in liquid assets, could live very comfortably in a managed community. He said those words the way people say them when they mean somewhere out of the way. The house needed a new roof within 5 years. The electrical panel was outdated. Association fees were going up. He had done his research, or pretended to, which amounted to the same performance. I noticed he never once looked at the garden through the window. Tom's garden. The roses along the fence. He had looked at this property 100 times and never once seen it as a place someone lived and loved. He had only ever seen it as a number. Lindsay looked at me across the table. Her eyes were doing something complicated, something that might have been a warning or an apology or both. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup. I thought about Cecilia at the Thursday group. I thought about Stephen's voice, steady and unhurried. I thought about Tom's reading chair and the peace roses along the front walk and the warm sandstone in Sedona. And I thought, you are offering me $400,000 for a house worth $1.8 million that is legally and entirely mine. That is not a settlement. That is an insult with a dollar sign on it. Derek, I said, I appreciate you coming. My answer is no. It will continue to be no. If you have a formal offer to make, please make it through Stephen Morrow. The humility left his face the way weather leaves, all at once, cleanly, with nothing underneath it. What was left was a cold, assessing anger that had probably always been there, waiting. He looked around the kitchen, doing the arithmetic of loss. The number $1.8 million was moving behind his eyes like a tide going out. You are making a very serious mistake, he said. I've heard that before, I said, from you in this room. He stood up. Lindsay stood up. She didn't look at me as she followed him to the door, and the not looking was its own kind of answer. At the threshold, Derek stopped for a moment with his hand on the frame, the pause of a man deciding whether there was one more thing to say that might yet change the outcome. He decided there wasn't. The door closed. The car left. The kitchen was very quiet. My heart was beating faster than I wanted it to. I would be lying if I said Derek Collins, in the moment the mask came off, did not frighten me. Not physically, but in the way a person frightens you when you see they are genuinely willing to do damage, that there is no floor beneath their willingness, that what restrains them is not conscience, but calculation. He had come hoping to buy me out cheaply. He was leaving with nothing, and people losing that much money are not finished. They are merely regrouping. I sat with that fear for 5 minutes. I let it be real, and then I let it do what fear properly does. I let it tell me exactly how seriously I needed to take what was coming, and I let it make me harder. I picked up my phone, stopped the recording, and called Stephen. "They came," I said. "You'll want to hear this." The recording changed things. Stephen listened to it twice, and when he called me back, his voice had an edge of quiet satisfaction that was the most emotion I had ever heard from him. He said Derek's statement about the $400,000 offer, combined with his reference to having spoken to Meridian's attorney while criminal proceedings were pending, amounted to what could reasonably be characterized as witness tampering and an attempt to obstruct a legal process. He said he was forwarding the recording to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office that evening. 2 days later, Derek was contacted by a detective. Her name was Carla Briggs, and she worked financial crimes for the county. Ruth knew of her by reputation. Thorough was the word Ruth used, with the specific emphasis of someone who had watched thorough people work and knew what it meant. Detective Briggs had spent 3 weeks by then building the evidentiary file that Stephen had provided: the forged deed, the recorder's filings, the fraudulent trust documents, the photo I had taken of the fake paperwork in my kitchen, and now the recording. She reached out to Derek through his attorney, who was by all accounts not pleased with the position his client was in. Derek requested that any formal interview be conducted with his counsel present, which was his right. But what he didn't account for, what his attorney apparently didn't fully prepare him for, was that Detective Briggs also wanted to speak with the notary, whose stamp appeared on the forged special warranty deed. That notary, a woman named Priscilla Vance who worked at a UPS store in Chandler, had no idea her stamp had been used on the document. She came forward immediately, confirmed she had never notarized any deed involving a Marjorie Hayes, and provided her own records showing no such transaction in her log. A forged notary stamp. Stephen said that, in terms of documentary fraud, this was about as definitive as evidence gets. The formal proceeding was a deposition, not a courtroom. Stephen had pushed for it as part of the civil suit, and Derek's attorney had agreed, apparently believing Derek could manage it. It was held in a conference room at Stephen's firm, a plain room with a long table and windows overlooking a parking lot. I was present. Detective Briggs was present as an observer. A court reporter sat at the end of the table with her machine. Derek arrived in a suit I had never seen before, new or recently dry cleaned, with his attorney, a thin man named Gareth, who kept his hands flat on the table in front of him like he was bracing for something. Derek looked at me when he came in and then looked away, which told me everything I needed to know about his level of confidence. Stephen was methodical. He began with basic facts, dates, documents, the chain of events as it existed in the public record. Derek answered steadily at first. He had a story, and he had practiced it. The trust had been his idea, yes, but Marjorie had agreed to it verbally. The deed had been prepared by a real estate attorney, he said, someone he knew. He couldn't remember the attorney's name offhand. He had understood Marjorie to be on board with the general direction of things, and then Stephen placed the forged deed on the table and asked Derek to look at the signature. "Mr. Collins, is this your wife's mother's signature?" Derek looked at it. "It appears to be," he said. "And can you tell me who witnessed this signature?" "I believe she signed it in the presence of the notary whose stamp appears at the bottom." Mr. Collins, we have a sworn statement from Priscilla Vance, the notary whose stamp appears on this document, in which she states unequivocally that she never notarized this deed and that her log contains no record of this transaction. I also have the forensic analysis of the signature itself, conducted by a document examiner, which concludes with high probability that the signature is not consistent with samples of Marjorie Hayes's known handwriting. Given those two facts, can you explain to me how this signature came to appear on this deed? The room was very quiet. Derek looked at his attorney. Gareth gave him nothing, just those flat hands on the table. There may have been an intermediary, Derek said. Someone who handled the paperwork. An intermediary, Stephen said. Can you name this person? I'd need to look through my files. You've had 3 weeks to review your files since this litigation was filed, Mr. Collins. You've had the document in question in your possession for 14 months, given that you filed it with the recorder's office yourself. Can you name the intermediary or not? Derek Collins, who had sat at my kitchen table with his leather folder and his borrowed vocabulary and his certainty that a 72-year-old woman with a garden would simply fold, Derek Collins opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the window. I need to speak with my attorney, he said. We'll take a short break, Gareth said immediately, standing up. But it was too late for breaks. The court reporter's machine had captured every word. I sat across the table and watched Derek Collins look for a floor beneath himself and find none. And I thought of something Tom used to say, in his plain contractor's way, whenever he caught someone cutting corners on a job. It always shows up in the inspection. I kept my face entirely neutral. I had been keeping it neutral for 7 weeks. I could manage another hour. Derek's attorney called for a recess, and they were in the hall for nearly 40 minutes. When they came back, Gareth spoke rather than Derek, which was, by that point, the only sensible decision anyone in Derek's camp had made. He said his client wished to discuss the possibility of a negotiated resolution to the civil matter. Stephen said any resolution would need to include full withdrawal of all fraudulently filed documents, restoration of clear title to my name, and a complete accounting of any proceeds already received or committed from the prospective buyer. He also said, and I watched Derek's face as he said it, that the criminal referral was not within Stephen's power to withdraw, as it had been made by me and was now in the hands of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Whatever Derek chose to do about the civil matter had no bearing on the criminal investigation. Derek looked, for the first time in my experience of him, like a man who did not know what to say. The civil resolution came together over the following 3 weeks. The fraudulently filed special warranty deed was formally revoked and stricken from the county record. A corrective deed was filed, recording 14 Sycamore Hill unambiguously in my name alone. The purchase and sale agreement between the fraudulent trust and Meridian Residential, LLC, was voided. Meridian had by then quietly withdrawn, their attorneys having concluded that no title insurance company in the state would touch a property with this history. Derek signed a civil settlement agreement acknowledging that he had caused the wrongful filing of documents against my property and agreeing to pay my legal fees in full, which amounted to $38,000. The criminal matter moved more slowly, as criminal matters do, but it moved. Detective Briggs presented her findings to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office in April. Based on the forged deed, the fraudulent notary stamp, the recorded conversation in my kitchen in which Derek described a sale he had arranged without my knowledge or consent, and the deposition testimony in which he could not account for the signature on the document he had filed, the county attorney charged Derek L. Collins with 1 count of fraudulent schemes and artifices under ARS Section 13-2310, 1 count of forgery under ARS Section 13-2002, and 1 count of fraudulent filing of public records. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Derek pled guilty to the forgery count and the fraudulent filing count, with the schemes charge dropped in exchange. He was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent entry on his criminal record, and the loss of his Arizona real estate license. He would never work in commercial real estate in this state again. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat in the 3rd row with Ruth on one side of me and Stephen on the other. When the judge read the sentence, I did not feel triumph. Not exactly. I felt something quieter and more durable, the specific satisfaction of a thing being made right that had been made wrong. Justice is not dramatic in my experience. It is procedural and slow and unglamorous, and it often requires you to sit in fluorescent-lit rooms reading documents for hours. But when it arrives, it is solid. You can put your weight on it. Lindsay was not in the courtroom. I had not spoken to my daughter since the Wednesday morning she had walked out of my kitchen behind her husband without looking at me. She had called once in February and left a voicemail that was mostly silence, and then her voice saying, "I don't know what to say, Mom." I had not called her back. Not yet. Perhaps someday. But some repairs require the damaged party to choose the timing, and I was not ready. I walked out of the courthouse into a bright April morning and stood on the steps for a moment. Ruth said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. "I feel like I want to go home and water my tomatoes," I said. She laughed and we went. The summer that followed was one of the quieter and better ones I can remember. I hired a landscaper named Marco to help with the heavier garden work. Not because I couldn't do it, but because Tom had always said you should ask for help with the things that aren't worth injuring yourself over, and the raised beds in the back needed new framing that was beyond what I wanted to manage alone. Marco was 26 and serious about soil composition in a way I found genuinely interesting. We spent several afternoons redesigning the vegetable beds, and by August I had the best tomato harvest I'd had in a decade. Stephen Morrow sent me a card in June. On the inside, he had written only, "Title clear. House yours. Well done." I put it in the fireproof box. Ruth and I continued having lunch on Thursdays at the diner on Central, and I continued going to the Silver Foxes, which had become one of the more useful and honest social arrangements of my later life. In September, Cecilia, the woman whose son-in-law had tried his own version of what Derek had tried, asked if I would be willing to speak to a group she was organizing for older homeowners about property fraud and elder financial abuse. I said yes. I spoke to 14 people in a community room in Mesa on a Wednesday evening, and I told them to keep their deeds in a fireproof box, to check the county recorder's records on their property once a year, to never sign anything they hadn't read twice, and to understand that the people most likely to defraud them were the people who believed they loved them. 3 people came up to me afterward with questions about their own situations. I gave them Stephen's card. As for Derek and Lindsay, I know what I know, which is limited, and I will report it without embellishment. Derek's guilty plea and criminal record meant the end of his real estate career in Arizona as a practical matter. His license was revoked. The plea agreement required him to comply with probation terms, including regular check-ins and financial disclosure requirements, which limited his ability to conduct any business involving property or large financial transactions. I have heard, through the ordinary indirect channels by which information moves in a city, that he and Lindsay moved to his brother's place in Nevada sometime around the fall. I don't know the specifics of their finances. I know that the $38,000 he paid in my legal fees was real money to them, given what I later learned about the state of their accounts. Lindsay called me in October. This time I answered. We talked for a long time. It was not an easy conversation. She said things I had needed to hear for a long time, and I said things she needed to hear, and neither of us pretended that what had happened could be undone or fully explained. I am her mother, and I will not stop being her mother. But I told her plainly, I loved her, and I would not let love be used against me, and if she chose to build a life with Derek Collins going forward, that was her choice to make as an adult, and I would have to make my own choices accordingly. She cried. So did I. It was the most honest conversation we had had in years. By the time the peace roses came back the following April, pale yellow, faithful as always, the house on Sycamore Hill felt like mine again in every sense that mattered. Not just legally, not just on paper. Mine in the sense of a place you have defended and chosen and earned back, which is a different and deeper kind of ownership than the one you inherit or purchase. I sat on the porch on a warm April morning with my coffee, watching Marco work in the back garden, listening to the birds in Tom's elm, and I thought, this is what I was fighting for. Not to win, to stay. That seemed like enough. More than enough, actually. It seemed like everything. Here is what I learned. Your name on a document is not a small thing. Your home is not a passive object waiting to be managed by someone younger or louder. And the people who count on you to be confused are counting on something that is yours to deny them. If someone had handed you those fake documents and told you you'd be living in your car, what would you have done? I'd love to know. Leave it in the comments. And thank you, genuinely, for listening to my story.